Hello, I'm Jonathan Moore, and this is SEO in 2024, Additional Insights.
Jonathan, what's your additional insight for SEO in 2024?
My additional insight is to, when planning strategy, to leverage data analysis and what-if scenarios to effectively navigate ambiguity and the unknown.
So what data analysis are you referring to when planning a strategy?
So I think it's important when starting a strategy, or I think if we look at what sort of constitutes good strategy, is sort of having this sort of alignment with a bigger picture and a clear sense of direction. So what I like to do with like any client or strategy that I'm pulling together is to essentially gain a good situational awareness of what's happening. So primary data sources, as I'm sure you're aware, is analytics data, such as Google Analytics and the Search Console. But you've got other data sources that supplement that, such as Majestic. So really it's having the time and the skill to be able to interrogate that data to get a good understanding of the existing performance in relation to the bigger picture. So I find there that, as SEOs, we do have the ability to work in silos. So I think it's important to be able to zoom in and zoom out to be able to get that understanding using the data of how SEO fits in amongst that bigger picture at like a broader channel level and as a sort of a business level as well.
So you mentioned a few sources of data there, GA4, Search Console, Majestic. Are there any specific reports that you tend to use on a fairly regular basis as a better source of reliable data?
Yeah, so when it comes to sort of, I guess, creating reports, I tend to think in segments. So I try to sort of start with, say, total traffic at the top. And then if we drill into that, then you've got your channel data. And then you drill in further, then you've got your actual then you start looking at landing page data. So I try to sort of build segments. That's a sort of very basic 3-tiered segment there. But I try to get into that. How does everything fit as a bigger picture? So if you think of something like a tree map, how does organic fit within that? How does then you can group landing pages into like page templates or content groupings? So I want to understand, get a feel for how everything fits together. So like an e-commerce concept, you've got your homepage, you've got your list pages, you've got your product detail pages. So I want to know the relationship. So at the beginning, I want to know what percentage of traffic's coming into the homepage. I want to know what's going into PLP pages, and then I want to know what's going into PDP pages. So how does that fit as part of the composition almost? And then sort of once I've got the idea of the composition, I want to start looking at the time series data. So how has that trended over time? So again, you've got your organic, the classic organics trended like this. Maybe there's been an update and a bit of a drop, or there's been a release and there's been an uptick. But understanding that composition and the time series data is normally my main starting point. And then I do a similar process with Search Console. The Search Console, of course, has the query data. So then it's more, how can I segment the queries to get that understanding of what the composition is? So again, Search Console, you can get page query reports. So I can get the granularity there in terms of, okay, these are the queries that are landing on my PDPs versus the queries that are landing on my PLPs. So again, it's just building sort of layers there on top of each other.
So I liked your tree example there, and obviously you talked about e-commerce as well there. Is there an ideal percentage of traffic that you're looking to land on your product pages versus other pages, home pages, other category type pages on your site?
I think the main thing to understand there, so the next thing I'd be looking at there is actually like what the depth of stock you have, right? So you could have, say, a smaller D2C sort of brand that has maybe like a handful of products, like say less than 20 products. Or you can have a merchant with, say, 100,000 products or 10K products. So the strategy or the approach might be dependent there on the products you have, the product variants. So then sort of working back, knowing that number, and analyzing what products you have would give me a good indication of what is a sensible traffic percentage for PDPs versus PLPs. So generally speaking, and probably if I've got a smaller range or inventory, traffic to PDPs is going to be higher, versus if I've got a large inventory, probably going to be a more PLP-centric approach. So it's an understanding sort of not just where the traffic's coming, but actually what the inventory looks like as well in that sort of e-com context.
And you said that this data also helps you prepare for what-if scenarios. So what are some typical what-if scenarios that you're trying to prepare for?
So the what-if normally comes in as like when you're looking at time series data, right? So Search Console, it's got 18 months, GA4 typically around 14 months in some of the reports now. So really what we want to understand is what levers have been pulled. So that goes back to being able to zoom in to organic sort of performance, and then what other maybe external levers have been pulled. Good example there would be like an algorithm update or a chain migration. So there might be levers that have been pulled, or levers that might be pulled or anticipate being pulled there. So the example there could be that you look at the links and you feel that the link profile might not be where you want it to be, and it might be vulnerable to an algorithm update, or you feel that your content's not strong enough to perform well, and it might be vulnerable to an upcoming core algorithm update because you've seen volatility in the past around these sort of types of updates. So using what's happened in the past can help you prepare for the future. And I'll use that what-if scenario. So it helps you prepare or anticipate. So what would happen if, like saying the core HCU stuff, what would happen if we had to rewrite all our blocks? Yeah, just as sort of an example. So, and you know from your crawl data that you got 500 blocks. What would happen if we had to rewrite 500, all 500? Or can we get away with rewriting the top X%? So it's understanding those what-if scenarios, because planning's generally done, say, at like a yearly level, right? So in the context of an agency, or even like if you're working in-house, you're probably going to get a budget for a year. So there's a list of activities that you want to do over that time period. So being able to anticipate what might change or what you want to do, or by creating your scenario planning, that helps you then figure out what pieces of the jigsaw you need to get in place.
You mentioned that your link profile may not be as you hoped it would be. What does a link profile look like that you're not particularly content with?
I think in most cases it's just, again, when you're doing that initial bit of situation analysis, it's just getting a feel for what the type of links, type of citations you have, and the type of places you're getting them versus primarily other peers or sites in your sort of sector. I think it's worth having a handle on what maybe low quality links you do have. I wouldn't say that you should go in and do disavow straight away, but it's having that awareness of what historical activity has been done in a link building context.
So disavow is not a word that I hear very often nowadays. Is that still something that it still works as far as you're concerned?
I haven't done disavow for a long time.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, yeah. You brought it up.
Yeah, I know. So now I've got to get myself out of this. So I think as SEOs, like, we're not good at dealing with paradox, right? So the disavow is a great example of a paradox, right? That Google are communicating, you don't need a disavow, and a lot of SEOs are saying, don't need a disavow, and there's been tests done on that, right? So some evidence is suggesting don't do that. And then there's other schools of thinking, like, and it's something like Mike King's talked about, is that, you know, putting sites into tiers. So again, if you're in a certain tier, Google might treat your links slightly differently. It's having that, going back to sort of the critical thinking and dealing with paradox, that what works in context A might not always work in context B. So I wouldn't necessarily rule it out. As you can tell, as I said, I haven't done too many for a long time, but I think it's having that situation awareness to anticipate, well, okay, I think as a sort of minimum, you want to get a feel for, are our links good enough, right? And then how are we going to build better links?
And one of the worst case scenarios that you mentioned is the possibility of having to rewrite 500 blog articles. So how do you actually determine that it's the quality of the content that has been the issue?
Yeah. So how do I determine quality content? So I think there's some just good old fashioned content inventory to start with, and actually eyeball the blogs. I think there's been a lot of good stuff put out in the community in terms of how to assess that, in terms of, let's say, the newest set of guidelines, particularly on the stuff that's been primarily written for search engines. So I think core principles are still adhere. So I think it's going through everything, and again, having a feel for what's sailing close to a certain threshold that you think might be susceptible to a future change. It's not necessarily being, I think SEOs kind of operate in binary, right? And there's probably like a continuum. So again, it's understanding, okay, yeah, we got these, I got a client that I sort of taken on fairly recently, that I've got a load of articles that have been directly written to target sort of PAA searches, and the quality's not great on them. So we're having conversations, well, we don't think these are great. What would it take to sort of rewrite them or make them better? It's sort of those sort of questions there. It's again, knowing what lever we could pull if we had to do something, or do we want to pull that lever proactively?
But it's not great based upon readability and delivering specific value to users, as opposed to some metric of whether or not that article is bringing in traffic or ranking highly.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's more that it's sort of been primarily written for a search engine, and it follows a very sort of particular format that is, I think, designed not necessarily to help the user answer their question almost. I think like the good example there is like, what time do Everton kick off on Saturday? I'll go on like a newspaper site, and I got to scroll through a load of stuff just to get to the answer, if you know what I mean. So it's sort of, I think, using the guidelines as a basis there to assess what you consider to be good or bad or room for improvement.
Yeah, and is it even worthwhile attempting to compete for these types of keyword phrases in the future, if Google are perhaps going to just incorporate them as a direct result, an AI result, initially on the SERP?
Yeah, and that's another great what if question, right? So is what if Google roll out AI on our AI overviews we've got a handful of queries that we feel more than likely it's going to be rolled out. How do we mitigate that potential traffic loss? Or is that traffic that's always been at risk because essentially the quality wasn't necessarily there in the first place? Because again, there's a potential school of thought that if Google are choosing to show an AI overview, perhaps then the corpus isn't strong enough anyway, and it's something that they can essentially plagiarize and paraphrase.
You talk about using this data analysis to help you navigate ambiguity. What ambiguity are you attempting to navigate, and why is that important?
Yeah, so for me, ambiguity is just like making decisions without knowing the full picture, right? As marketers, you're never going to get that full picture, right? Or it's like an agency or freelancer context. You're never told everything, right? You find out there's been a release, or someone so did this, or we briefed someone else to create a load of stuff. So it's being able to make sensible decisions based on the information that you have available to you at that time, and knowing, I think, what to prioritize and what not to prioritize.
You've shared what SEO should be doing in 2024. Now let's talk about what SEO shouldn't be doing. So what's something that's seductive in terms of time, but ultimately counterproductive? What's something that SEO shouldn't be doing in 2024?
I think as a generalization, there's a real skill in knowing what not to do. I think as sort of, we have this obsession, not obsession, but try to avoid going into the minutiae. So it's the ability to be able to zoom in and zoom out of the detail. I think SEO should be avoiding to do like cookie cutter strategies. So, giving someone a 12-month plan that is masquerading as a strategy, that's not a strategy. It's cookie cutter. So I'd avoid trying to do that. So I've sort of gone around the houses there a bit, but I think it's knowing what not to think, putting a lot of thought of what not to do, specifically in the context of if you're doing like a 12-month plan, it's just like a copy-paste job. It's probably not a good thing.
Jonathan Moore is director at Jonathan Moore Consultancy Limited, and you can find him over at jonathanmoore.digital. Jonathan, thanks so much for adding your additional insight to SEO in 2024.
Thank you.
I've been your host, David Bain. You've been listening to an episode of SEO in 2024 Additional Insights, a Majestic series that complements the original SEO in 2024 podcast, video series, and book. Find out more at SEOin2024.com.